Guys, let me fill you in on just some stuff that's been going on with the engine. Yep, the engine fires up, runs, but was very rough at idle. Spent the last couple of days trying to figure out what was going on with the engine. I really had no idea. I did use some diagnostic. I wish I had the Durametrics one. That's a much better diagnostic for this car, but I did have the CarSoft diagnostics, which were good enough to get you a real general impression. This is the CarSoft. I guess the average Porsche owner would be fine with this, but if you're really trying to get down deep into some engine functionality problems, this is just really going to read codes and the regular ODB diagnostic measurements. It was good enough to get me close enough to where I understood what was going on. What I was mainly using from this tool was the engine was throwing a bunch of misfire codes. At one point I thought I had nailed it down to a single cylinder, but that was just by chance. Cylinder number 4 had misfired on 2 tests that I ran. I didn't run a whole bunch. I swapped out the coil. It was nothing to do with the coil, but that was a pain. If you guys ever replaced the plugs on this particular engine, the bank, you can see here, well, number 4 is in number 6 position now, but number 4 is all the way behind this muffler, and trying to get at it is a royal pain, trying to get at that coil pack. Did all that work, had no effect. Continued on and found that it had nothing. It was just random. That cylinder number 4 was misfiring. All the cylinders were misfiring after I ran it a little while. What I noticed was the fuel trims were up as high as they could possibly go, meaning the computer was trying to dump fuel into the engine because it was seeing way too much oxygen come out the other end. So it's trying to add fuel to compensate for the extra oxygen coming in through a leak, is what the bottom line was. There was a leak somewhere in the manifold area or somewhere in the vacuum system that was allowing air into the chamber at a much higher rate than the computer was able to figure out. What was happening was it was just trying to dump fuel in there to keep the engine running at idle because so much air was coming in and the mixture was wrong. The outcome on the diagnostic tool, the fuel trims were at plus 25% short-term fuel trim, and the O2 sensors were down to almost 0 voltage, like basically 0, which indicates that I believe that indicates a very lean condition, meaning not enough fuel is getting in. Just way too much oxygen coming into the sensor. I believe that's what the really low voltage means on the O2 sensors. Everything I read was pointing to a vacuum leak, but I didn't have the vacuum leak diagnostics are generally dumb a bunch. Pump up various parts of the manifold and see where it leaks with smoke or something like that. And I didn't have a smoke machine. I just didn't know what. I was checking I figured maybe I didn't hook up a vacuum line. I was trying to undo various pieces of the vacuum to see if that made it better or worse. And that really wasn't working. I was undoing components while the engine was kind of running. I was taking off different lines and seeing that. Yeah, the bottom line was that wasn't really, when I would do, the vacuum leak wasn't bad enough that the engine would immediately stall. It just ran really rough. So when I did undo the lines and see if the engine changed, well, yeah, it did. Because I made the vacuum much worse, it made the engine stall completely or ran worse. So the vacuum leak was small, but not large enough so that the engine was compensating enough so that if I took out a large hose, it would continue to run. Yeah, I was just baffled. So anyway, coming back to where we're now, here's the beginning of, where I kind of started to figure out some stuff. So one thing I noticed is I came out to the garage and was shocked to find that the floor was just completely soaked with oil, I thought. And I panicked. I didn't really notice the color of it. I just saw that there was oil all over the floor after, putting the engine back together. I had missed a seal. I was panicking, and where I looked, it was dripping out of the bottom of the transmission where it connects to the engine. I thought I'd missed, or not connected right the IMS flange seal. I thought I maybe missed that, or cut it when I put the two halves together. And the thought of undoing the transmission and putting it back on again was just, I was not in a good mood. But then I caught the refraction of the color of the oil coming out in it, and it was green, and that is not the motor oil color. That turns out to be the power steering fluid color. Power steering pump I got off of eBay was maybe not worth it. It was coming out of there just full bore. It's just... So anyway, the bad news was the leak. The good news was I found two things that were wrong in here. All right, so what I want to explain here about what happened with the car. First, we'll go over some key ingredients when you're diagnosing, say, an engine that won't start or a engine that's running rough or things like that. So here's how I backed into the problem. As each problem was fixed in the system, it led to uncovering other issues. The first thing to understand is that air has to come in at this mixture with gas. So 14.7 to 1 is a typical gas air mixture for gasoline you get at the pump. The nature of this can change depending on what the gas is. Diesel is a different ratio potentially, and E85 can have a different ratio too. And then finally, the last ingredient is the spark. So if you're having issues with the engine running or not running, assuming there's no mechanical failures in the engine itself, you've got a problem with a mixture of air and gas or potentially a spark. We can talk about issues with valve train, but we're going to skip over that for the sake of time here. But either you have too much air or not enough air, or too much gas and not enough gas. So it's a balancing act between air and gas and spark. So when you're going to troubleshoot the rough running, you're going to use your meters in your car, the ODBC readings to understand the outputs of some of the sensor arrays down here. So if we're thinking about this as a bit of coffee that we're making, and the engine has a particular interest in keeping a ratio of coffee to sugar, then the ingredients have to be combined at this exact ratio. And here are the tools we're going to use to make sure everything is happening at the same time. So looking at the measurements coming off the mass airflow sensor, this measures the amount of air coming into the engine. The measurements coming off the first bank of the O2 sensors, which is measuring the amount of oxygen coming out into your tailpipe. And the injector here is not a sensor at all, but it is the thing that the computer can control to get this ratio correct. And that's only concerned about getting the ratio correct. So the CPU is involved in here, coordinating all those things. So This is coordinating all the events here. So we can up or down the injector input. That's really the only thing in this ratio that can be controlled. The amount of air coming in is controlled via a different mechanism. So the only thing the computer can control really is the amount of gas being put into the engine. The flywheel sensor determines when this piston is at top dead center here. For simplicity, sorry, we'll just say top dead center. The computer can vary it depending on a bunch of different factors, but for purposes of this diagram, we'll just say top dead center is when the flywheel sensor will come on. If this isn't working correctly or it's broken, the CPU will report it as a check. But if everything is running, but it's just running rough, you're going to concern yourself with air and gas. And it's potentially that the spark is not firing because the cylinder pack for the spark plug is defective, cracked, or the spark plug itself is so filled with crud that spark isn't happening properly. For issues with the car running, essentially at this point I've eliminated the spark by swapping out foil packs and making sure the engine does run in a time sequence. The timing of the flywheel and the spark aren't in question in this particular case. And now we're down to air and gas. One of the things I worried about was that the gas was not fresh, and maybe that was causing some misfires from rough running, which does happen sometimes if the gas has been sitting around a long time. So that was a concern that I wasn't sure about. My first instinct when I'm looking at this wasn't that the injectors were wrong or anything issues there. My first concern was potentially an air leak coming in either out of the manifold or a cracked vacuum hose or a cracked oil fill tube. Lots of things can cause a vacuum leak at the manifold level. The issue at hand, to describe what's happening, is the computer is doing the measurement of the air at this sensor here. So the computer knows exactly how many gallons of air per second is flowing across this. The other important factor in a mass airflow sensor is the temperature, ambient temperature of the air flowing through. Hotter temperatures would make the oxygen more sparse, then very cold temperatures allow a lot more oxygen to be present coming across the sensor. So it's a combination of temperature and what the air flowing across that mass airflow sensor is detecting. A potential cause is after the sensor, air getting into the system and going across the throttle body. Now, in this scenario, it can come in after the throttle body or before, but if air is slipping past the mass airflow sensor, then the computer doesn't know what to do. It's confused, right? Because now the calculations it's doing is showing that more air is coming into the system than is expected. So it's going to start to enrich the gas. It's going to tell the injector to open up more because there's more air coming in to counter that. The computer detects more oxygen coming out the exhaust side, and it's going to go ahead and tell the injector that, hey, the system is running lean because I'm detecting so much more oxygen here than I'm expecting to come into the system. So I'm going to dump more fuel. So problem number one, when I looked at the ODBC readings, the injectors were set at plus 25%. So I knew something was going on to make the system want to dump more fuel into the combustion chamber. So that led me to believe that there was an air leak. mainly because really the service manual covers every single bit of this car except for the power steering. In order to get at some of the bolts here, I took off the throttle body. That's where I discovered the vacuum leak, and pretty big gaping hole in the vacuum system here, which is the electronic operator for the throttle. This is the air oil separator hose line. So I thought maybe there was a crack in this, but that wasn't it. Or maybe I didn't seat it properly. So when I took the throttle body off, I noticed got a gasket kit, and it did not include a really important gasket. So if we take this off here, you'll notice there's a really big missing part here. Yeah, right here. There's supposed to be a really big gasket. Really obvious when you kind of look at it now, and when I took the throttle body off, I noticed it right away that there was clearly missing that gasket there. I used a little RTV sealant just to see if I was right, and it turns out I was. That was the main reason why it was running so rough. It was just missing this main seal here. So air was coming in through here because the throttle body is just a metal plate that sits on here. And this is hard plastic, so the seal between those two was just really completely inadequate. And air was dumping into the intake manifold, creating a huge leak and creating tons of havoc with the computer. That didn't understand what the heck was going on. Yeah, this was causing totally rough running, and at lower RPMs and idle, it would just misfire and eventually shut down. So that's what I battled. That was a big whoops. So note to self: don't throw away your gaskets before you find the replacement. The gasket kit does not have this in it. Actually, the gasket kit that I bought for this engine was missing several key gaskets that I either had to reuse or order. So this is on order, and we're just going to wait for that to come in. In the meantime, I'm going to fix this power steering leak. All right, guys. Get you up to speed here. The engine start ran fine. Well, not fine, but rough. Figured it was a vacuum leak. Did some testing. Found out I missed a gasket right here. In the throttle body, a gasket was missing. Big one. I used a little RTV sealant around there to see if the car would start and run, and it did. It started and ran fine. Would idle even. I took the RTV sealant all off. I finally got the gasket in, put it in place, and now the car won't start at all. And now I'm just trying to figure out where this vacuum leak is, if there is one. I debated maybe a bad MAF sensor. I really don't know. So, big problem number one that I discovered, I was missing a gasket on the throttle body. So that gasket on the throttle body was causing a very large air leak to come in. More air was coming into the cylinder than was expected. So the computer was trying to keep up by dumping more fuel into that system and balancing out this ratio. But 25% is the maximum that the computer will put out. And if it keeps up at that number, it will actually produce a check engine light saying engine lead. I didn't let it run long enough to actually have that check engine light come on. It was very evident that something was wrong. So, big problem number one. I had forgotten or missed a gasket going on the manifold gasket. I thought about it. When I discovered that issue, I put a little bit of RTV sealant over the leak, and that actually made the car run a lot better, because now not as much air was getting into the manifold, and the computer was able to balance this mixture here. But here's the thing. When the gasket finally came in and I sealed off this hole and reduced that leak, the very next problem number 2, came up. Now, once I fixed that leak, the engine wouldn't run at all. It just sat there turning over and over. And what I did notice is that gas smell was very strong coming out here. The engine was putting gas in at a far larger rate than the spark was even able to ignite. There just wasn't enough oxygen coming in to even get the piston to light. It wouldn't even catch. That's how much gas was being dumped into the system. And an important point here is that the CPU won't start adjusting this injector until the loop is closed on the sensors. So the O2 sensor will not start working until, I don't know the exact number, about 5 to 10 minutes into the engine running. Until then, the O2 sensor is not at the proper temperature to measure the oxygen. The engine does know how much is coming in, but it runs on this automatic program before it even gets to starting to adjust the injectors. So the car would not even start because the CPU wasn't able to detect and reduce this amount, whatever it was going to do. Hey guys, back at it again. I think I found one of the main problems here besides the big vacuum leak. I don't think it's a vacuum leak. I'm pretty 99% certain this is a problem with the fuel injectors I've ordered, and I've ordered the stock fuel injectors. I ordered a slightly bigger version. When I originally ordered them, I didn't realize that requires an entire remap of the ECU. At the time that I bought them, it just says it fits my car, so I was like, okay, let's take it. But it doesn't. So when I discovered that, just by observing the car won't start, but tons of gasoline is coming out the back of the fumes and stuff coming out the back of the car. It wouldn't catch because there's no oxygen. The injectors were just pumping out way too much gas at the beginning starts of the engine. And the beginning start of the engine, it's not really taking the MAF sensor into account, and the oxygen sensors aren't really working at the start of the car. So it's not adjusting the flow rate at the very beginning of the cycle. It's only once the car starts and gets running will it start to adjust flow rates of the oxygen sensor. So this is all in theory, but I'm in the process right now of going in and replacing, which is kind of a pain, replacing the fuel injectors. You can see the fuel injector rail right here. I can wiggle it a little bit. So the fuel injectors attach right here. So I just have to replace 3 on this side and 3 on that side. I'm making that sound a lot easier than it probably is going to be, but so far so good. You really just have to move the wiring harness cables out of the way. This is what these wiring harness cables sit on top of the fuel rails. That sounds odd, but it's protected. All the electricity is running on top of the fuel rails, but that's how it works on both sides. So just really a matter of moving and disconnecting a few of the sensors, and moving the electrical wiring harness out of the way, and now I can access the fuel rail, and these are held in by little clips. So just a matter of prying those clips out of the way and letting the fuel spill out and putting in the new injectors. Really, really, really hoping that A, that fixes the problem, and B, this is not a 3 or 4 day job or something like that I'm going to get myself into. So fingers crossed. All right, we'll check back in and see if this fixes the problem. All right, guys. The problem number two. Problem number two is that all I could tell was way too much gas was going into the cylinder and out the tailpipe. All you could smell was gas coming out the other end. So then I knew I had an issue with the too much gas and not enough air. So what had happened with that was when I purchased injectors off the site that I was purchasing them from. Of course, you enter in the model and make and all that stuff. I did. This is the drawing for a naturally aspirated engine. Turbo works by forcing more air and therefore making more gas into the system to keep the ratio correct. The issue was that they had turbo injectors listed on the naturally aspirated engine that I had. And basically, I purchased the wrong injectors through sheer ignorance and with a little assistance from the website. These injectors were far too large for the engine application. They were for a turbo application, and the computer did not understand that I bought the wrong injectors and was treating these injectors as standard Porsche injectors, and therefore, even at a low pulse rate for the injector, it was injecting far too much gas. So the issue with that is you can take it in, have it tuned, and have this fixed, but I had no way to even get the car down and have it tuned. I didn't even have a tuner available to fix this ratio issue. So I simply had to take out all the injectors and replace them with the standard Bosch injectors. So that was the issue. Two big problems. The manifold had a very large leak because of a missing gasket, and the injectors were far too large for the engine. Now, if one of these had only happened, then the engine would have never started. This was a very large leak, and the engine would have never started if this leak was there on its own. If the injectors were there and they were correct, the car would have never started. If the injectors were wrong and this was not leaking, this car definitely would have never started. So it was the combination of this air leak and large injectors that actually made the car start. So two wrongs did in fact make a right by accident, and that's the issue that came out with this car. Those are the two problems. So technically the engine should have never started, but it did fire it up right away. Once I replaced these injectors and fixed the air leak, the engine ran fine. So I just want to take you guys through a little bit of the thought process around discovering issues with air and gas coming in.